All right, good evening and happy Earth Day. My name is Susie Plott and I am the Community Development and Marketing Manager for Old Mission, Santa Barbara. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening and to acknowledge that we are in the traditional land of the Barbareño Chumash people. As a Franciscan organization, it is important for us to actively participate in the work for racial and social justice and to acknowledge our past as we try to build a more just world. Tonight's program and this series are a part of our efforts towards these goals. This series is being offered free of charge. However, if you would like to support this and our other programs featuring speakers or topics such as these, you can do so by making a donation to the mission through a link that will be included in the follow-up email or by visiting our website. However, this is completely optional. We appreciate your support just by joining us this evening. We will also be sending out a link to a survey this evening as well if you would like to provide feedback on this series or suggestions for future speakers or topics. A few housekeeping items before we begin. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website for the community. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be keeping an eye on them during the presentation, and we will have time at the end for a brief Q&A. I would now like to introduce our moderator this evening, Dr. Ann Petersen. Dr. Petersen holds a Bachelor's of Arts degrees in History and American Ethnic Studies from the University of Washington, a Master's in American Civilization and Museum Studies from Brown University, and a PhD in Public History from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Dr. Petersen has worked at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation for the last 20 years in several capacities, including Curator and Associate Director, and has held the position of Executive Director for the last 4 years. Among other projects, the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation operates the El Presidio de Santa Barbara State Historic Park for the California State Parks. Petersen has served on the board of directors of Glida Valley Historical Society, including a 3-year term as president. She currently serves as vice president on the board of Downtown Santa Barbara. She is also a proud 2015 graduate of the AASLH Seminar for Historical Administration. Petersen is especially interested in the ways historic sites can become more responsive community resources, and she champions the role of public historians in helping communities manage change. Hopefully, you see why we have her as our moderator this evening. Dr. Petersen, I now hand it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome, and we're so glad that you're joining us tonight. We have been on a journey through this wonderful series and have learned from the best about the complex history of Junipero Serra, the relationship between Native people and the missions, the changing face of the friars themselves, and what we all have to gain by centering Native voices in the presentation of their own history. Tonight, we will conclude the series by exploring the ways that the history of early California continues to evolve. Note that I'm talking about history here, not the past. The past is the past. Someone before me has already said. History is the story that we tell ourselves about the past. And the only constant about that story is that it changes. And we're going to talk a lot this evening about the powerful potential of change in the field of public history. So I want to spend a minute on historians' relationship with change. The National Council for Public History explains this well, and I'm quoting here from their website, and I'll drop it into the chat. People sometimes assume that historical research is a once and for all process that will eventually produce a single final version of what happened in the past. Historians often hear charges of revisionism when a familiar story seems to be challenged or changed. But revisiting and often revising earlier interpretations is actually at the very core of what historians do. And that's because the present is continually changing. So why does our history, our presentation of history change? So here are some ideas that I have for you, and you can all add to the list. We ask new questions based on what's happening to us now and what we want to learn. Also, new evidence comes to light. For example, archives are declassified, papers transfer from private ownership to libraries. And also, in an effort to create an inclusive history, we consider additional perspectives, and we as a profession become more inclusive and diverse. Our speakers tonight are part of a growing group of professionals who are seeking to create a more inclusive public history of early California. By public history, I mean history that's presented, used, and sometimes created by the general public outside of a scholarly setting, although all three of our speakers work in scholarly settings as well. Tonight, we're going to explore the ways that a public history of early California has evolved and is still changing in three distinct settings: public education, statues and monuments, and museums and exhibits. Our speakers will each give a short presentation on these topics, and then we will continue with the group discussion. And finally, we have a call to action of sorts for you, our audience. How can you be a part of this work? And what can you do with the content from this series to participate in a more inclusive public history of California? Please be thinking about this question during the presentations, because we have some answers, but we also want to hear your ideas. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Niki Sandoval is a Senior Strategic Development Manager for West Ed, a research development and service agency working throughout the United States and abroad to improve educational outcomes for youth, children, and adults. She's also the former education director for the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. She worked in partnership with tribal government leaders to refine education policies and strategic educational investments, including school readiness, educational attainment, and career transitions. She is a continuing lecturer in the Department of Education at UC Santa Barbara, where she engages undergraduates in the examination of equity issues in education. A trustee of the Santa Barbara Foundation since 2013, she served 2 terms as a member of the California State Board of Education. Her career began at the J. Paul Getty Museum of Art and continued at the Smithsonian Institution, where she held the position of Assistant Director of Community Services for the National Museum of the American Indian. Sandoval holds a PhD in education from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University, and a BA in Public Relations from Pepperdine University. And then we have Dr. Steve Hackel. Born and raised in California, Steve earned his BA at Stanford University and his PhD in American History from Cornell University, with specializations in early California and the American West. From 1994 to 1996, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Alejandro Institute of Early American History and Culture in Williamsburg, Virginia. He taught at Oregon State University from 1996 to 2007 and joined the faculty at UC Riverside in the fall of 2007. Within the larger field of American history, Hackel's research specializes in the Spanish borderlands and the California missions. He's especially interested in Native responses to colonialism, the effects of disease on colonial encounters, and new ways of visualizing these processes through digital history. His publications include a biography of Father Junipero Serra, a monograph on the California missions, numerous essays, a textbook, and 2 edited volumes. He is general editor of the Early California Population Project and the project director for the Early California Cultural Atlas. He co-curated the Huntington Library's international exhibition, Junipero Serra and the Legacy of the California Missions. He's currently co-chair of the Early Modern Studies Institute seminar on the Spanish borderlands. His current work involves the study of immigration and community formation in California before 1850, and we're looking forward to that. And Dr. Monica Orozco holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Chicano Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She earned her MA and PhD degrees in history at UCSB, specializing in Mexican colonial and 19th century history and religious studies. Her dissertation focused on Protestant evangelization in Mexico among indigenous peoples in the late 19th century. For several years, she taught in the history department at Westmont College as a visiting scholar and as a lecturer in the history department in the Latin American Iberian Studies program at UCSB. She served on the board of directors of the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library for 5 years before being appointed director in 2009. In 2016, she was also appointed executive director of Old Mission Santa Barbara. So welcome to our panelists. And our format for this evening is that we're going to have 3 5-minute presentations, one from each of our panelists, on our main 3 topics: public education, representations and monuments, and museums and exhibitions. And we will start with Dr. Sandoval on a presentation about public education.
Thank you so much. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. Just want to make sure you can see the slide deck. Thumb up, great. Haku maktuka Niki kascholiti nono kwashla kalwashak. Hi, I'm Niki. I'm really happy to see you. And I grew up on the Santa Ynez Indian Reservation near the town of Kalawashak, the shell of the turtle. And I'm just delighted to be here. Before we get started on the topic, I want you to meet my family. Margarita Bernal was baptized at Mission Santa Barbara. She's the elder in the background of this photograph. She's my 3 times great-grandmother. Rosa Cota, my great-great-grandmother, was baptized at Mission Santa Ynez. And I also wanted to mention that Margarita Bernal, her parents were baptized at Mission Santa Ynez, and her grandfathers were baptized at La Purísima. So I have long-standing, deep connections to mission-based communities. So I just wanted to share that. And this picture was taken in 1901 on the Santa Ynez Indian Reservation. So I think it's always important to start off with my personal connection. I'm an educator, and at UC Santa Barbara, one of my students one summer, several years ago, said that she was inspired to find out what contemporary children's perceptions were of Chumash people. And she was working in Santa Barbara in a summer program with 10-year-olds. And she asked the 10-year-olds to draw a picture of a Chumash person. And these were 2 of the images that came back. And you'll see these triangular structures that really look like teepees. And you see horses and males, one wearing a loincloth, the other one is bare-chested and has a bow and an arrow and a quiver over his shoulder. And so these are more reminiscent of Plains Indian imagery. And this other image here on the left looks like there's a child or a person wearing possibly war paint, could be maybe a war bonnet or a feather headdress on the left. And then on the right, you can see a happy little scene. It's actually on the right, there's a child and it looks like a little horse, and there's an op, which is actually a traditional dwelling, a tule home and an op. And so there's evidence there that the child who drew the image on the right had some exposure to Chumash history and possibly culture. And the other image that I wanted to share with you, which I thought was really interesting, this 10-year-old had some knowledge about the fact that Chumash people and settlers lived at the same time in this place. And you can really see the level of detail that this 10-year-old offered in the images. And you actually see not just a representation of Chumash, but the fact that there was acorns, smashing acorns, leaching the tannins, the bitterness out of the acorns, the tomol, our traditional watercraft, cave drawings, shaking trees to get acorns, an adobe house. You see a lot more description and clearly a more local perspective of indigenous history of this place. And then on the right, you see drawings of presidio, pueblos, missions. There's even an illustration of Junipero Serra on the lower right and a naming of that individual. But it's really interesting to see what is a common perception. I only showed you 3 of the images, but primarily, and she gave me a set of several, and the vast majority really showed Plains Indian culture, had nothing to do with local history. And so the thing that I'd like us to consider is what's present and what is absent from the narrative. And I think it's an interesting thing to explore what is present in our public education in 3rd and 4th grade when we address in our public schools early California history? What is present? What is not? What's completely invisible? And how are we supporting educators with high quality curricular resources, but also professional learning? So I am happy now to invite our next speaker to share, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Dr. Hackel.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you see my my screen shared, my PowerPoint. Thank you, Niki, for passing the baton on to me. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your words. And I want to thank Monica, Susie, and Anne for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. This is an amazing series, and I'm just honored to be one of the speakers with you in this series. In a panel on changing representations of public history for early California and changing representations of how we teach history, I thought just a very quick way to get a sense of how dramatically things do change would be to take a look at some images or sculptures that represent Father Junipero Serra, who of course has been very much in the news for the past year or 18 months, or even perhaps for the last 2 centuries, truthfully. But I think we're at an inflection point in how we understand Junipero Serra. So I thought I could just show you some images of how over time public representations of him have changed, I think, rather dramatically. I'm going to move very quickly here with apologies, not pausing too much. I've grouped these images into, I think, what are some major themes, but I won't be talking too much about the artists who made them or specific details. Serra died in 1783, born in 1731, and just after his death, the public representations of him were very much out of a Catholic tradition, trying to burnish his image as a saint, as a holy man, as a deeply spiritual Catholic. And you can see here on the left, an image of Serra receiving communion before he died. In the middle, the woodcut from the hagiography of Serra, in which he is sort of this impenetrable saintly person rising up above the people. And on the far right, a 1790 image painted in Palma, Majorca, to sort of commemorate his last moments. And you can see he's sort of a very weathered man who seems to be accepting his fate as he passes from this earth. Those are the first sort of commemorations of Serra intended to, for pedagogical purposes, intended to teach people about who this man was. Those were the enduring images for about a century as Serra sort of slipped off the landscape in both Majorca and California. He was resuscitated in the late 19th century, and he was portrayed as a muscular and patriotic padre. You can see on the far left, the first public image of Serra, the first statue that was displayed in the US. And both of these images suggest Serra as a strong, physically strong, robust man, which he actually wasn't at all. On the left, sort of the more, the sort of person arriving on the boat. On the far right, the image is probably familiar to you from Ventura, which is a 1930s image of Serra, but very strong, very muscular, certainly, a very vigorous man. He also, beginning in the turn of the 20th century, was described as a heroic colonizer. This is a man who is not radiating a Catholic knowledge or theologic knowledge. This is a man who's conquering, and we can see on the far left a very dramatic statue by Tilden showing him in Golden Gate Park. The middle image is the Catarine statue that now is in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol. And on the far right, we see a similar image. What unites all really is the very sort of basic stripped down cross, not a crucifix any longer, no body of Christ. These are sort of generic Christian figures who are moving forward, who are bringing missions into the world. And on the far right, the coin really does demonstrate Sarah as a colonizer, the sense that he was bringing to a barren civilization or a barren region, European civilization, holding up sort of the cross as the emblem of Christianity. No native people to be seen, nothing really representing the history and culture of the region. That was obliterated from these heroic colonizer images. Late 20th century, as the Sarah canonization movement took off, Sarah was recreated. On the far left, we have the portrait that was created to honor his beatification in 1987. And Sarah here is a left-handed man, unusual, who seems to walk with nature, sort of not a confrontational figure, not holding his hands up, not dominating the landscape, but just sort of blending into it. This is the humble padre who walks among peaceful people. In the middle, we have the Hannon statue, which is known to many of you. There are at least 100 of them throughout the state of California, or there were up until about a year ago. This is the peaceful padre again. Here he's right-handed with a giant right fist, certainly. But again, this is not a confrontational man. We don't have the cross, no crucifix. He's Catholic. We know that by his Franciscan gown, but he's not really represented in a way that radiates Catholicism or even religion in any way. On the far right, the most modern reinvention of Junipero Serra is the official canonization portrait, in which Serra seems to emerge almost like a burning figure from the California missions, his hands clasped in prayer. And of course, just off to his left is the Virgin of Guadalupe, which in many ways, while Serra did visit the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe after he just arrived in Mexico City in 1749, just before New Year's Day of 1750, the Virgin of Guadalupe was not a figure of devotion for Serra that we know of. This is an attempt to turn Father Serra into essentially a Mexican priest or Mexican immigrant, to create a relationship between today's Serra, as he's imagined, and the people of Southern California, the people of California. Missing from all of these images, of course, is what we most identify with Serra today. I think his evangelization among Native peoples and the mistreatment of Native peoples in California missions and the terrible legacies of those missions. But in none of these images do we see any Native people. However, if we look carefully, we can actually see some. In the first image to the left, we see Native parishioners praying behind Serra in the background. In the middle, we see some Native peoples, not California peoples, certainly, but Native peoples who seem to be awed by the future saint, who are sort of falling, holding their hearts, overwhelmed by his power. And a third view of Serra and Indians, I think, is perhaps in some ways the most interesting. These are 20th century statues. On the far left, the 1914 statue that was unveiled at Mission San Juan Capistrano that shows Serra as his church backers really wanted him to be seen, as a paternalistic protector of Native people who were themselves childlike people who needed protection from the church and from the great man. So on the left, we have Serra really bringing into the church, essentially, Native peoples. In the middle, we have Serra reaching out and holding a Native child. And that same image, interestingly enough, was recreated. The first one on the left becomes the one on the far right. That's an image of Serra, a statue of Serra that was unveiled in 1988, incredibly, very recent, actually, which sort of shows Serra as a paternalistic figure. The one on the right was unveiled in Mallorca, Spain, and the Native child is facing us naked, whereas in the Mission San Juan Capistrano, the statue, the Native is sort of is hiding his nakedness, essentially hugging Father Serra. We can't see his body. So I guess what I wanted to suggest to you very quickly, schematically, in an overview fashion, is that Father Serra, like much of our early California history, like all of it, has been, as Anne suggested in her opening remarks, reinvented generation by generation. And what we often have today are these permanent, seemingly these permanent representations of Sarah that no longer speak to us today, that no longer represent the history that we want represented, yet they still remain in public, mute to us, or in some ways offensive to us. But certainly Sarah has changed over time, and many of the representations we see of him were created in a different time, speaking to a different audience and sending a different message. With that, let me pass it on to Monica, and I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Steve. And I'll try to start mine. So I'm going to speak today in this short presentation on our efforts at Old Mission Santa Barbara to bring more voices into our museum, in particular, the voices of Native peoples or Chumash peoples from our community, and represent the history in our museum more fully. I'm sharing with you an image of a room where we focus on the mission period. And previously, sorry for the dog speaking, but previously in this room, we did not do a very good job of communicating to our visitors that missions were communities of baptized Native peoples. And so we really sought to address that in this room by talking about what life was like before, during, and during the mission period, and what changed, what continuity there was, what adaptations there were, but what was lost. And so we tried to focus on that in this room. And we also tried to bring in not only the experiences of Native people, but literally what we did is we brought in the voice of a Native person. In previous presentations, you heard that there was a recording of the acts of faith, hope, and charity, a prayer in Barbareño Chumash that was recorded by Ernestine Ignacio de Soto, and that was actually for an exhibit that Steve co-curated at the Huntington a few years back. And they very generously gave us a copy of that recording to go with our prayer board. This is a reproduction of the prayer board, but the prayer board was part of that exhibit as well. And we can now have that in this room, and our visitors can press a button and hear Ernestine's voice. So we have literally brought in the voice of a member of the Barbareño Chumash community. But also as part of our experiences in trying to be more inclusive at the Mission Museum was how do we address concerns of the Chumash community now? And this came out of a survey of mission museums that was promoted or sponsored after the canonization of Junipero Serra. The Serra Cause organization, as well as the Bishops of California, sponsored surveys of mission museums by Native Californians and sought out their opinions, their responses to the present condition of exhibits and the way they were telling the story of Native peoples in the mission era. And what a major concern that came out of those surveys was that visitors leaving mission museums would leave thinking that California Indians no longer exist. And that was this focus on Indians as a past, no longer existing community. And so we took to heart the concerns of that survey to try to address them in our museum. And so the question we were faced with was, how do we address this concern? What kind of an exhibit or many exhibits or message throughout our museum could we help visitors get and understand? And so really the challenge for us that was presented was to seek out members of the Chumash community and listen, to ask them what would they want our visitors to leave with, what message they would want our visitors to leave with, and to really listen to that. And so what they what they told us, and that whole process really became a collaborative effort between some members of the Chumash community, our staff, and our consultants that we worked with. And this is what came out of that collaborative effort. This is an exhibit in the last room in our museum tour. And the message that the Chumash community wanted our visitors to leave our museum with was that of continuity, that the Chumash people have been here for generations, for thousands of years, and that they are still here, vital members of their own community and the broader community. And so this is what we set out to do. So as you look at this exhibit, what you're seeing are 4 panels with family trees, 4 different families of Chumash that can be documented from the mission era to the present day. The base of this exhibit has photographs of the current generation that the families gave us to use. Also on the base are works of art that some are pre-contact, some are during the mission period, and some are more modern pieces to again represent the continuity. And so to take a closer look at a couple of these panels, thanks to John Johnson, who helped us with building these family trees, and thanks to the families themselves who gave us photographs to use. You can see two examples here. John actually mentioned in his presentation Chief Yananali and his descendants. And we also have, of course, Ernestine de Soto's family tree. Sadly, we need to update it because we recently lost Angela Yee, but this shows the continuity. And we have 2 more families to show that. And they very generously let us do that. And then in terms of what message we have here, how do we know what we know? A little bit of information about the 4 families, but really the message that many Chumash descendants today continue the work with their elders to revitalize Chumash culture, and also vital members of, and they are also vital members of both the native and non-native communities through their work in education, anthropology, linguistics, medicine, counseling, and as first responders. They are your neighbors sharing their ancestral land with everyone here today. We honor them and are thankful for their strength of community and culture, which has always been here. And so this is really what we came away with, is this idea that we needed to be inclusive. We needed to be able to listen and bring in many voices. And so hopefully, for some reason, I always lose my share bar here. So if Susie can help me out by unsharing my screen, that would be great. Thank you. I don't know why I lose it, but thank you. So that's pretty much, so I'm going to turn it back over to Anne to get us going.
All right, thank you to all of our panelists for those presentations. You have seeded the conversation very well. I'd like to start with more exploration on Dr. Sandoval's presentation about public education. Niki, I think you demonstrated visually how children absorb and remember narratives in the classroom. That was really powerful. And I think what a great way of evaluating learning with really young children is to have them draw what they learned. And it demonstrates how powerful those narratives are and what's taught in the classroom. And I know that you've acknowledged that teachers face a lot of challenges when they're trying to change or evolve or work in new narratives. Can you talk to us about some of those challenges, and then maybe for the whole group, what can we do to encourage schools to create new narratives, and what are some of the solutions for our overworked teachers?
Thank you, Dr. Petersen. I think about the narratives and the question of what narratives are we used to in our public education system and what could be challenged. And I have to say that I feel like the narrative predominantly is invisibility. And I think some of the images that Dr. Hackel presented demonstrate that this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, for centuries, it's as if we did not exist in the narrative. So it's not a surprise that we're not going to show up in curricular resources or in preparation for educators. And I think also we seem to be placed as Native peoples in the history, social science domain. And I think right there, that presents a challenge in and of itself, because I know that history tells the story of the past, but we're very much situated in the present. And there's this thread of continuity, as Dr. Orozco mentioned in the exhibition, that there's this continuous line that we're living this right now. And so just with the history social science standards in California, those were adopted in 1998. 1998, so we're in the year 2021. And as scholars in the room, haven't some things changed since then about our knowledge, our understanding of history? And so the textbooks have been refreshed in the last 4 or 5 years. There's been a new framework for history, social science that was adopted in 2016. I was a member of the State Board of Education and reviewed all of the books. And I think there have been some significant improvements. It's never enough. You never get enough real estate for the subject matter you're passionate about, but it takes actually legislative action to change the curricular standards. So that right there is a huge task. But what's happening is tribal communities themselves are developing curricular resources. So first person voice, first person accounts, lesson plans, visiting classrooms, both in person and virtually, developing videos, websites. So Indigenous peoples are taking leadership and responsibility for changing the narrative. So that's a counter narrative to the invisibility. And then the last point I'll make before I invite other colleagues to share is that museums and cultural centers are making some high quality resources available, both in person, but also virtually, which has been great. And then that goes from lesson plans to online exhibitions, webinars, symposia, professional learning. And that, I think, has really gone a long way to supporting our educators throughout our public school system. Not just here, but in the COVID era, it's also made the world smaller, and we were able to get information out beyond the state, but to educators wherever they are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. And it's just amazing experience that you were involved in the California State Board of Education and have had a hand in helping to improve our state curriculum. So we're grateful to for your contributions. Steve or Monica, would you like to jump in on this topic?
Well, I would just say that that's another challenge for us, the archive library. For instance, how can we make our collection more accessible and useful for educators to be able to access and supplement their curriculum with our primary sources, especially. And we have been trying to work on that. And on the Mission Museum level also, what kind of virtual experience videos, short and mostly short, can we do? But also it's a challenge for us when we look at what the tour experience is going to be for classrooms when they come to the mission and come to get a sense of what the era was like, and that speaks to us in terms of what is the narrative we are telling on these tours, and what is in our museum. And we've been trying to address the museum, and we really need to make sure that our narrative, whoever might be guiding the tour or is helping to bring in the voices, to be more inclusive and to get away from that invisibility that we've been talking about here.
I would really just second what Drs. Sandoval and Orozco have said. I know that when I teach courses on California history, or for example, I'm teaching a course right now on Los Angeles history, that I think the greatest thing to overcome when I talk about the earliest period is students' perceptions that most Native people simply vanished or were not really present from the very beginning. So bringing in somebody whose ancestors were actually at the California missions, having them talk about their experiences, having them explain their own perhaps complicated relationship with a figure like Junipero Serra or the California missions, I think is a really, I'm totally convinced that my students remember what they say a year from now and they've forgotten that I even exist, and that's fine. I think the power of their words is much more powerful than mine. I think working to create complicated narratives is something that we all need to do. I think we have sort of stock figures from the pre-1850 period, and I think we need to complicate our understanding of almost all of early California history. And that's something that I think all of us have to be involved in some ways, in many ways, in all ways, frankly.
Thank you, everyone. Let's move on to statues and monuments of Dr. Hackel's presentation. And Steve, you showed us that a statue is not a static thing in itself, that statues are made in a reflection of the moment in which they are created, and the representation of a single person can evolve over time. And we know that statues and monuments have been in the news a lot this year, from Confederate statues being removed to the removal of statues of John Sutter and Junipero Serra and an El Camino Real bell in California. And in addition to the representations changing over time, we know there are multiple perspectives on every statue and monument, right? There's the creator, the artist, who funded it, who owns it, and the viewers who themselves have multiple perspectives. So when we're thinking about these statues and monuments and whether they're still meaningful to us today, are there perspectives that you feel like should be privileged or not when we're thinking about where to go with some of these monuments?
I think you're probably specifically talking about monuments and statues that commemorate people like Junipero Serra, I'm guessing. Well, I think we have to understand that those, as I was saying, those statues tell a story that was generations old. And you know, it isn't, I mean, our knowledge about what happened in the California missions, I think, has grown dramatically. Our ability to see what happened in the past has grown dramatically. Our ability to care about it, to have empathy for it, to fully understand Native motivations and the motivations of Junipero Serra has expanded, I think, dramatically. I don't know how you capture that complexity in a statue, in a painting, maybe more in a painting or a mural than in a statue. I think we have to sort of break our dependence upon bronze and marble to tell stories about the past and engage living people, or for example, that incredible room you've created at Mission Santa Barbara, which tells this complicated story of Native peoples and their survival. I think we have to look to different sources and different ways of representing the past. I think we can no longer just put up a statue and expect that it will sort of speak truth. I think those days are pretty much over. One would hope they are.
Thank you. Dr. Sandoval or Dr. Orozco, do you have something to add to that? Well, go ahead.
Oh, no, just something brief. I think what I really appreciate out of Steve's, presentation is that how the statue, when it's erected, really, and as you pointed out, represents something that may not have a meaning for us now anymore. It represented a particular time, a particular group that was promoting it. And that meaning gets lost, and it becomes a truth that we really don't know what it's rooted in. And, you know, does that mean we need to remove all statues, or does it mean we can do something to help, you know, make that more complex? Can we add something? Can we have some kind of, you know, another, you know, we should ask Native communities, right? What would they want to help complicate that story? You know, that history, a response or something. Can there be some kind of interpretive display of how that has changed over time, or our interpretation or our views have changed over time, or where that statue actually came from at that particular time that it was erected. So I know for a lot of people, it's difficult to see statues or monuments of various kinds removed, but is there a different way to present them and interpret them that helps make the narrative more complex? You know, they're not an easy, I mean, it's a hard question, not an easy answer.
I think you bring up a few great points, and you know, one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking, Monica, was that some of the historical statues, the older statues, were developed with very little input from a few people, and representing you know, their perspective. And that's one way we can think about where do we go now? Can we create a much more inclusive process where we ask lots and lots of people what this means to them, what they would like to see happen, and create a public process around that. And you also mentioned it doesn't mean that there is necessarily an inevitable answer that a statue is going to be removed. It could be recontextualized in place or in an exhibition, and it's still an artifact regardless, that has value for that reason, reflecting the people who created it and installed it. So thank you for adding that complexity. And I'd like to move on to representation in museums, and responding to Dr. Orozco's presentation. Monica, do you feel like museums and historic places have a special role to play in sharing news stories and voices? What can those institutions do that others can't?
That's a really good question. And I think, as you know, someone who grew up and was privileged to grow up in a city where there were lots of museums to be able to wander into, and many of them free. So, you know, had a little bit of time downtown, I'd wander into a museum. That is often, for many people, a museum is the place where they learn the narrative, whatever that narrative might be. And I think that is huge. Once you are in charge of a place and you realize that is what's happening, that is a huge responsibility to think about as you go through and you do an exhibit, or you think about the overall message you want your visitors to have as they move from room to room, but as they leave. What are you leaving them with? And you know that if you don't give them a message, they will make it up. And what will that be? And that's a huge responsibility. So, you know, and you don't want to be, you also want to move people to think, to explore. And so how can you balance those where you can present a narrative or present questions that help people think about the narrative they might have learned. Someone of my age might have learned, you know, about a particular historical thing in school one way, and that was decades ago. And then you now, as you know, we've been talking about, those interpretations have changed. So how can you do that in a museum? The challenge of a museum is you have finite space, you know, and how do you make something complex in a finite space? You know, I'm just thinking back, and you know, you and I saw the Legacies of the Missions exhibit a few times. You know, we went a few times. And still, one of the most powerful things for me that I still talk about and still think about is when you walked into the main room and there were projected on the walls, Steve, you projected on the walls the names of all the Native peoples that were at the missions, right? How humanizing was that, right? That was powerful. And it was their native name and their baptized name, if I remember right. And, but it was just, I mean, they just were projected on there, and you saw these are people, right? And that changes the whole narrative, the whole interpretation, the whole experience of being in that. So that was very powerful. And I think that was a very effective way to use a finite space, right? And so it was, you know, again, those are the challenges we face.
Thank you. Dr. Sandoval, you have a rich experience in working with museums. How would you add to that question about their special role?
Yeah, well, I think I really appreciate those comments, and the power of just naming names and acknowledging the humanity. And in my earlier comment, I talked about, you know, as a Native person, I'm also Latina, you know, my father's from Mexico. And so I have a complex identity just in myself. But, you know, I think that first person voices, lived experience can go so far. And I'm going to share just a few slides briefly, but it speaks to voice. I, as an educator, I am always trying to encourage the next generation of teachers, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, storytellers. Statistically, Native peoples, we are a very small percentage of the general population. Just that fact in and of itself is a really interesting conversation starter. Why is that in California? Why is that in other parts of the country? I also think that we shouldn't just be in natural history exhibitions or in history museums. We were scientists, we were doctors, we are doctors, we're lawyers, we're legislators, you know, it's, we're engaged in civics. It's this entire breadth, mathematicians, statisticians. There's such a richness. And I think with museums, things that you can do that I think are frankly oftentimes beyond the capacity of our school, our educational systems, is developing resources for educators that are experiential and so rich and add another dimension to the learning. And this is a list, the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, the Autry Museum of the American West, Native Knowledge 360 has a wonderful interdisciplinary approach to providing resources for ongoing learning. A one and done workshop isn't going to do it. It has to be an ongoing part of your educational practice. And then our tribe, the Santinez Shumash, has a wonderful YouTube channel called Shumash Life with a range of vignettes on contemporary life, but also on history and culture. So I think that museums are dynamic places for living voices. And that to me is, that's one of the opportunities that museums bring. I don't think of museums as static places or repositories for objects. They're living places where people gather, where we dialogue. And that is the opportunity that museums provide for intergenerational learning.
Great, thank you. And I know we just have a few minutes left, but Dr. Hackel, we've mentioned your exhibition on Sarah in early California, and I know you will have a perspective on this question as well. For someone who's written several well-received academic books, what made you jump into exhibitions?
That's a really good question. I think, you know, I was trained probably like most sort of PhDs in history are trained to write books and articles, book reviews, and to sort of lecture in class. And I think I realized, maybe because I'd spent so much time at the Huntington, so the power of an exhibition. And I guess I just felt that we could make the history we were trying to share we could expose lots and lots of people from broad constituencies from all walks of life And I was fortunate that our department, UC Riverside, we have a strong contingent of public historians, Kathy Gudis and others. And so it was with their support. Kathy was the co-curator. So she was a huge sort of guiding force in the whole thing. But I guess I want to go back to something that Monica said about the power of naming people. And I guess Niki said that too. We worked really hard on that exhibition to try and shake up the narrative, not to have a show that was just about this one man, Juniper Serra. And a lot of people participated, lots of different institutions, certainly. But we had that 8-day video of the names. And, it was 14 hours times 8, I guess, it was really quite dramatic. And I wish there was a way to preserve such a thing, but I do know that people who came and saw it were moved by it. And that is, I think, very important. Yeah, I mean, I think that we as historians need to get out and try and do more work in museums, because as Dr. Sandoval was saying, what struck me most about that exhibition was when I would go into the gallery where the conversations people were having, that certain pieces of art and displays can really provoke conversation among people who don't even know each other. And I think that's you all could speak to this more powerfully than I can, but that was one of the great treasures, I think, of that moment of that show, the conversations that people had, and they sort of took with them in ways in which books and articles, stick with a few people, but they're not part of sort of the public consciousness in the way that a museum show could be.
Very much. We're going to wrap up tonight with our call to action. And I see we have several questions in the chat. I just want to let everyone know I've typed answers to a couple of them, and we'll try to find a way to work in a few more. Our call to action: what can our audience do to foster continued dialogue on this topic and help encourage change in a positive direction about the interpretation of early California history? And I know some of our panelists have come up with ideas. In particular, Dr. Sandoval has some suggestions for us. And if the audience, if you would like to put in the Q&A some of your ideas and suggestions, I would love to read them out to the group.
Yeah, I have 4 very brief recommendations. It starts with relationships, cooperative relationships, professional learning for educators, interpretive staff at our historical sites and our interpretive centers, acknowledging and accepting first-person voices as authorities and as content experts. There may be individuals who don't have degrees, who don't have the academic credentials, but they have lived experience and cultural and historical knowledge. So that needs to be elevated. And then finally, tribal community members are the best resource for accurate information. And if we can remember that and honor that, I think that will go a long way to creating a better world that we want to live in.
Thank you for that. Yes, respecting the agency of people whose history you are representing is vital. And there is a question in the chat about whether or not the presentation of museums in 2021 is different from 30 years ago. And I would say it is, and we still have a lot of work to do. But that is one of the important trends that we're all paying attention to, is how to include more voices of the people whose stories we are telling throughout the process of developing museum exhibitions. Dr. Orozco, do you have anything to add on this call to action?
I just want to maybe kind of echo that in a different way, is to listen. Sometimes we're too busy talking to listen. And I think listening is a really huge factor. Whether it's listening to members of Native communities, or listening to what are the conversations going on in your community, how can you participate in those? What is the conversation going on in your children's schools in terms of the curriculum, and can you participate in that conversation? So it's listening, I think, is really a key. to the, listening to the diverse voices in your community.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Hackel, anything to add?
Not a whole lot, just to echo what's been said. But what I would say is that, whether it's our history books, our lectures, or our museums going forward, I think we have to acknowledge multiple voices and multiple interpretations are possible. But I would say that they're not all equal, and that we have to acknowledge fully what happened in the colonial period between 1770 and 1821 or 1848 or 1850. And to sort of go back to Dr. Sandoval's question, why are there so few Native people? I think a full acknowledgement, even in institutions that are Catholic and that are owned by the church and that are at missions, a full acknowledgement of the terrible choices Native peoples had to make in missions, of the difficult aspects of their lives, and the survivance, however you want to describe it, of Native peoples, just has to be front and center. And I say that fully aware of the challenges in telling that story from within many of these places, which are, which are there to commemorate a very different story. And I think sort of decolonizing sort of the mission experience, the mission museum experience has to be front and center going forward. But I will say that's very difficult to do, but I think it's indispensable.
Thank you for that. We did have a comment from one of the attendees looking for honesty about the ill treatment of Native people in the missions. And Steve, I think you addressed that very well. And it's something that all of our panelists are very cognizant of and address in their work. I'd like to add one more idea to the call to action. We haven't had any audience response to that yet, but we'd love to hear your ideas. And that is to be active in your local government. You don't know really when these issues are going to pop up, and scanning the agendas for commissions and city council meetings is a great way to catch opportunities to speak out and get involved. And there are two that are very much live issues in Santa Barbara right now. One is after the murder of George Floyd, the local Black Lives Matter chapter called for a preservation of Black landmarks. And that Historic Landmarks Commission received 700 letters from community members in response to that. And St. Paul AME Church was landmarked within 6 weeks. And City Council last week just supported a grant application to create a Black History Historic Context Statement, which will lead to the preservation of more resources from that community that's been really under-recognized in Santa Barbara. And you can come to these meetings and support this work and show that the community cares about adding these perspectives to our local history. Another one is the Chicano murals at Ortega Park. The City Parks Department is doing a great job to revitalize that park. But the neighborhood residents felt like at the 11th hour before a grant application went in that the Chicano murals in the park were not being recognized. And they have organized and received grant funding to do bilingual door-to-door outreach to make sure that the neighbors get to participate in deciding what's important in their own community park. And that is also going through the process of being at public meetings. And so you can scan the news. These things pop up. It may look like a public art project, but it's about community identity and community history and who has the voice that should be lifted up to decide what happens to these really important physical resources and community memories. So I encourage you all to thank you for coming tonight. That's a sign that you're engaged, you're interested, and you want to do more, and stay in the conversation with us. So with that, we're at 6:34, and I thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists, and congratulations to Old Mission Santa Barbara for a wonderful series on early California and new directions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.